wake of that, DOD has said, if you are serving in a state where abortion is banned, we will pay for your travel from that state to another state. We will say that you don't need to use unpaid leave to get to that other state. And we've said, we, DOD, not me, has said, if it's, if you want to take a little longer to talk to your commanding officer about one of the most personal decisions anybody could make, any family could make, any woman could make, we're going to give you a little bit of extra time to do that. Those are the three things. I'll bet 80% of the American people support those things. And I guarantee you, more than 80% of the American people do not support the idea that we're going to hold up every single flag officer who's coming here for a promotion at a moment when Putin has invaded Ukraine and China is rattling their saber over their idiosyncratic view of how the world ought to work. I heard somebody today said, well, this veterans rule violates the Hyde Amendment. First of all, the Hyde Amendment is as well known, doesn't even apply to the VA. And if it did, Madam President, guess what? There are three exceptions to the Hyde Amendment: rape, incest, and the health of the mother. So they're even trying to turn back Hyde. That's what they're trying to do on the floor of this Senate. And they're messing with the readiness of the American Armed Forces to do it. What brought us here? What brought us here was the Dobbs decision. What brought us here was a court packed with a wish list of people that for 50 years have been fighting for an originalist, so-called originalist, made up, but an originalist conception of constitutional law. And they finally found a guy in the form of President Donald Trump who is willing to put these people on the court. And they gave the court the majority they needed to eviscerate Roe versus Wade, to strip this fundamental right, to strip this fundamental freedom, and to do it with contempt. To not wrestle with the question of what is going to happen to people serving in the armed forces of the United States if they are unlucky enough to need an abortion and they live in a state like Alabama, for example, where if you are a doctor and you perform an abortion, you can go to jail for 99 years. Although admittedly, there is an exception in Alabama for the life of the mother. This endpoint, I hope it's an endpoint, this endpoint of that 50-year war on freedom, war on Roe versus Wade, war on a set of expectations that women in particular have in this country, but that families have in this country. That war was brought to a conclusion in some sense by a majority opinion written by Justice Scalia that came down, essentially, read it, essentially came down to this: if it wasn't a right in 1868, it's not a right in 2023. If it wasn't a freedom in 1868, it's not a freedom today. Forget that at that time, the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, black people and women didn't even have the right to vote. Didn't even have the right to vote. But in the 21st century, when we're meant to compete in a global economy, in a society that by any measure is still profoundly unequal, but far more equal than it was in those days, where women do have the right to vote, where black people do have the right, thank God, in this country to vote, we're reading the language in 1868 and saying, well, was it a right or a freedom then? That's how we're going to decide whether it's one today. in the early 90s when I was in law school, and when we knew that it was at the dawn of originalism, I mean, that was happening right then. It was part of the Reagan Revolution. It was part of law and economics. It was part of making the shareholder the supreme being in the United States of America. It was part of that whole measure, that whole time period in the country's history. That's when some genius, and they were a genius, came up with the word originalism to describe a legal ideology that says we're only going to look in the rearview mirror to figure out what our rights are today, as if they could divine the intent of the founding fathers on a question like abortion, who, by the way, had massive disagreements among themselves. Anybody who's ever read even even a signpost or a tourist, some sort of signpost on the side of Independence Hall in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia knows how many disagreements the founders had with themselves. The idea that somehow you're going to divine their one view about what the Constitution should say, it is preposterous. But here we are. Here we are. And we were told when this happened, don't worry about it. This is just a matter of the Supreme Court sending this right, sending this fundamental freedom back to the states. That's all. It's just an exercise in federalism. Well, Madam President, since this happened, since Dobbs was passed, 18 states have banned abortion. My kids are, one kid who's about the age of the Pages now, two others are older than the Pages now. I am telling you, I was with my daughter Caroline the other day, riding through Colorado, looking at the billboards that we went by, and I said to her, man, Caroline, she's now 23, that if you had told me 20 years ago that in 2023 we would be living in a country that was legalizing marijuana and banning abortion, I would not have believed it. I would not have believed it. She doesn't believe it either. As my friend John Tester says, my friend, the farmer from Montana, says his daughter is having to fight for rights that her mother never had to fight for because her grandmother won these rights. And now we're rolling it all back because the Supreme Court majority that Donald Trump made possible after all these years, after all this effort to strip the American people of this freedom, has decided if it's not a right in 1868, it's not a right today. So 18 states have banned abortion. 9 have no exceptions for rape or incest. There have been now restrictions on freedom to travel. Madam President, Texas famously has put $10,000 bounties. It's like the Wild West all of a sudden, where if you are a friend or a neighbor who's driving somebody to access abortion services, you can get charged, and you catch them. Somebody catches you, says you shouldn't have been doing it, you can get a $10,000 bounty. In Florida, in the Sunshine State, I think Florida is the third largest state in the country. One of them, third largest state in the country. In broad daylight, actually, to be honest with you, it was at 11 o'clock at night. The governor has now signed a 6-week ban on abortion. 1 in 3 women don't even know that they're pregnant. A third of women don't even know that they're pregnant at 6 weeks. I don't know whether the governor of Florida knows that or doesn't know that, but it's an interesting question. Which would be worse, him knowing it or not knowing it? And now, all of a sudden, 9 million veterans and their families, including 2 million female veterans, live in states that have banned abortion or restrict it in ways that would have been unimaginable to my daughter Caroline, to families all over the country. And as I said, in some limited way of dealing with it, the VA announced these rules. But these narrow rules that have to do with rape and incest, the life of the mother, they're not enough for the senator from Alabama. And this afternoon, he's forcing a vote to strip away the VA policy and impose a position on every veteran in America that's more extreme than his own state. Hyde doesn't apply to the VA, and even if it did, there are exceptions for rape, for incest, for the life of the mother. That's not extreme enough for them. His resolution would ensure that veterans who have been raped, who are victims of incest, whose life is at risk, can't seek an abortion at the VA, along with their spouses and their defendants. Even in Alabama, there's an exception for the life of the mother. And they have one of the most restrictive abortion laws in the country. I'm going to come to an end because my colleague is here from Nevada. But I got two colleagues here from Nevada, so I'm confused. And I said I was going to finish, but I'd take a couple minutes and then finish. But by saying it is tragic that we have to have this vote in 2023. It is. This is a tragedy. It is a tragedy. It is a spectacle. It is an embarrassment. But at least people will have the opportunity to know where every member of the Senate stands. And they're going to understand what a 50-year political effort to strip America of this freedom looks like. You know, Madam President, there was a survey in a poll last month in Florida, and my colleagues, won't be surprised to know this. 75% of Florida opposes a six-week ban. 61% of the GOP in Florida oppose a 6-week ban. Let that sink in. Maybe that's why, I don't know, I'm not a great politician, unlike some people, but maybe that's why he was signing it at 11 o'clock at night. Maybe that's why when the governor of Florida signed it, he sent out a tweet that didn't say he had signed a 6-week ban on abortion to Florida, because 75% of the people there oppose it, just like the majority of Americans. And so I think we should defeat this resolution. I think the American people should take note of every single vote that's cast here by these senators. But really, as important as that, we need to understand what's happened to our politics, what's happened to our Supreme Court through this 50-year war on American freedom and this 50-year war on a woman's right to choose. And we need to come together as a country and codify a woman's right to choose so the next generation of Americans has the benefit that the last 50 years of Americans have had. And with that, Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The senior senator from Nevada.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the following senators be permitted to complete their remarks prior to the scheduled recess. Senator Rosen, myself, Senator Klobuchar, and Senator Smith.
Without objection. The junior senator from Nevada.
Thank you. Since the Supreme Court overturned long-standing protections for the fundamental right to access abortion care nearly a year ago, we have seen countless attacks on women's reproductive rights from anti-choice states across our nation. States that are banning abortions without exceptions for rape or incest. States that are risking the lives of women who have miscarried. And I've been doing everything I can to stand up and to defend a woman's fundamental right to make health care choices for her own body without interference from anti-choice politicians. And this includes making sure we protect our veterans' rights, and that includes the right for those veterans to make decisions over their own bodies. Our veterans and their families, they've risked so much to protect our nation, to protect our rights, and we owe it to them to defend their fundamental right to access reproductive care regardless of where they live. They put themselves in harm's way. We must protect them. That's why last year I urged the Department of Veterans Affairs to make it clear that they will provide access to abortion care to veterans and their families, and I'm glad they listened. But today, anti-choice Republicans in Washington want to overturn that restriction, and they want to restrict our veterans' access to reproductive care. And that's what today's debate is about. If they get their way, and they roll back this rule, the VA healthcare system would no longer be allowed to provide abortion counseling or any kind of care to service members and veterans, and listen to this, even in the cases of rape, even when the mother's life is at risk. I'm not going to let that happen. My state of Nevada is honored to be the home of hundreds of thousands of veterans, and we are a proud pro-choice state. When Nevadans sent me to the Senate, they sent me here to fight for their rights, and that's what I will always do. So, Madam President, I urge my colleagues to join me in fighting back against this ideological attempt to restrict reproductive rights for veterans by opposing this resolution. For our veterans, for our women in Nevada, for women everywhere in the United States, I urge a no vote. Thank you.
Madam President.
The senior senator from Nevada.
Madam President, I join my colleagues today to continue to speak out against these far-right Republicans' harmful and frankly insulting resolution to prevent women veterans from accessing essential health care in this country. Our veterans stepped up to serve our country, putting their lives on the line to protect our freedoms and keep our families safe. We owe them a debt of gratitude, and that's why I'm working to ensure we protect veterans' rights to essential health care. We trust these women to make critical decisions in the line of duty to protect our national security, so why don't extremists on the right trust them to make decisions about their own bodies? The purpose of the VA is to protect veterans' health and lives. Since the Supreme Court struck down Roe v. Wade, my colleagues and I pushed the administration, including the VA, to take action to protect women veterans across the country and their access to abortion care. At our urging, the VA created a rule to provide abortion counseling to pregnant veterans as well as abortion services in the limited cases of rape, incest, or the life or health of the mother. This is critical for women veterans, especially those who live in states with strict abortion bans and no access to care in their communities. But we knew that after the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, antitrust policymakers wouldn't stop trying to take away a woman's right to choose. And now they're going after the health and well-being of the women who fought for our country. There are 550,000 women veterans who get their health care through the VA. 300,000 of those women veterans are at a point in their lives at which they need reproductive care. That's 300,000 women who have sacrificed for our country and who, according to extreme Republicans, don't deserve to make their own health care decisions. Some of these women veterans live in states where they can access reproductive care outside the VA, but over 155,000 of them live in states with harsh abortion restrictions on the books. Now, I'm leading legislation to ensure our veterans and all women maintain the right to travel to pro-choice states to get the care they need. Unfortunately, for many of these women, the VA is their only option for accessing abortion care. That's why the VA's new rule is so critical to protecting veterans' health and why extremist Republicans' attacks on reproductive care are so dangerous. Women veterans put their lives on the line to fight for our freedoms, including control of our own bodies, our lives, and our futures. And now the far right wants to take these freedoms away. Madam President, we cannot let that happen. We have to ensure that this resolution does not pass, because we should be looking out and protecting the rights of women across this country, not taking away those rights and freedoms. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President.
The junior senator from Minnesota.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I rise today in strong opposition to the resolution before us today. This resolution would overturn the VA's rule protecting veterans' access to abortion counseling and care in cases of rape, incest, or when the life of a woman or her health is endangered. And unfortunately, it is just the latest attack on women's freedom to make their own healthcare decisions without interference from politicians. Today, veterans, their spouses, and dependents are protected and have the freedom to receive essential health care in the most devastating of circumstances. By voting yes today, the Senate would take that freedom away. So let's be clear about what this means. A yes vote means that you would be saying to women who are entrusted to protect our national security that they can't be trusted to make their own medical decisions. You would be saying that a person who has been raped or the victim of incest should not have the freedom to get an abortion. You are saying, in effect, sitting in this chamber, that those of you sitting in this chamber should have the power to decide what health care a veteran can receive if she faces a serious or even life-threatening health risk if she continues a pregnancy. So if you are considering a yes vote, I ask you, what makes you think that you know better? What makes you think that you should have the power over another person and their body? This is an insult to the dignity of people, to veterans, and to their families. These are people who have given so much, and yet this body would deprive them of their rights to freedom and self-determination, the very rights that they sacrificed and fought to defend. Colleagues, I understand that people have differing views on abortion, and I respect that. But I cannot understand why anyone would think that they should have the power to impose their own views on others in such extreme ways. Because this resolution is extreme, and everyone who votes for it is saying that when it comes to our nation's veterans who get their health care through the VA, that there should be no exceptions for abortion, even if that veteran has been the victim of rape or incest, even when continuing the pregnancy would endanger the veteran's life or health. That is not just extreme, that is cruel. Madam President, here in this chamber, some are also going after current service members. There is currently an unprecedented and reckless campaign in this chamber to hold up the promotions of career military personnel in order to force the Department of Defense to deprive service members of their legal rights to seek abortion care. Let that sink in. They are willing to compromise our national security and leave 187 important military leadership posts vacant in order to enact their dangerous and unpopular anti-abortion agenda. And they're not doing this because it's what Americans want. It's the opposite, in fact. According to a Pew Research Center poll, over 60% of Americans say abortion should be legal in all or most cases. Madam President, before I was in the Senate, I worked at Planned Parenthood, and I saw there firsthand the capacity of people to make good decisions, moral decisions for themselves and their families about how and when or if to start a family. So I ask my Republican colleagues to reject this extreme proposal. Ask yourself, why do you think that you know better than these women, these veterans, whose lives and stories, whose health and family situations you will never know? And I can tell you, for women, this is personal. They don't want any of us making these decisions about their bodies and their health and their families for them. They are perfectly capable of making these decisions for themselves. So I urge my colleagues to stand with our veterans and vote to protect their rights after they fought so hard to defend ours. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the Senate stands adjourned in recess. The Senate stands in recess until 4 p.m.